welcome, as I said, to Women's Liberation, a Revolutionary History, part of our Revolution Festival. So we've got two fantastic speakers. We've got Katherine Connelly, who is one of the biographers of Sylvia Pankhurst and a writer and counterfire activist, and Rachel Holmes, who is also a writer, and she's an author in this context of books about Eleanor Marx and Sylvia Pankhurst. So they're both going to speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for sort of questions and discussion. So I will call on Katherine Connelly first.
Thank you, and thank you very, very much, Elaine. I want to just start by saying what an absolute pleasure it is to be talking about these ideas with Rachel, who's brought so many revolutionary women from history to life in a way that inspires people, inspires so many people to try and change things in the present, and that's all of what today's about. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Where I would like to start is with revolutionaries who looked at historical developments to understand how women's liberation could be achieved. Karl Marx, who we'll be talking a lot about today, who was looking at the position of women and how that changed historically when he died. And when he died, his notes on that were read through and gone through and worked over by his lifelong comrade, Friedrich Engels, who published them as The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, which is a wonderful book on women's oppression and where it comes from. And in that book, he at one point considers the question of what sexual relationships will be like after a revolution. And I'm going to read a quote here from his answer to this. He says, "What we can now conjecture about the way in which sexual relations will be ordered after the impending overthrow of capitalist production is mainly of a negative character, limited for the most part to what will disappear. But what will be new? That will be answered when a new generation has grown up, a generation of men who never in their lives have known what it is to buy a woman's surrender with money or any other social instrument of power. A generation of women who have never known what it is to give themselves to a man from any other considerations than real love, or to refuse to give themselves to their lover from fear of the economic consequences. When these people are in the world, they will care precious little what anybody thinks they ought to do. What anybody today thinks they ought to do. They will make their own practice and their corresponding public opinion about the practice of each individual. And that will be the end of it." So why is this important? I think it's important because it links the question of the liberation of all women in a sphere that's often deemed non-political and intimate and private and individual to the abolition of capitalist society. Not, as it's often caricatured, to something after the revolution, but something inextricably bound up in it. So why is that an important insight? Well, I think it's important because the oppression of women is often discussed as if it's something that's an occasional misfortune that befalls individuals, like not getting a promotion in a company. And very often the solution proposed there is, oh, if we just had better representation, it would be fine. Or as something indeed that's so widespread in society, it's just bound up in our interpersonal relationships or behaviors that perhaps even we're not even aware of ourselves. And the example of this, I don't know if people saw, but last month, LSE and the Women in Banking and Finance produced a report, which, as the BBC said, concluded that mediocre male managers are blocking women's development in the finance world because they're better at office politics. And again, sort of often the solution that's proposed here is about maybe raising awareness or presumably getting better at office politics or leaning in or whatever it is that we're supposed to do. Now, representation and awareness are real issues and they're important, but they're not the causes of women's oppression. They're rather symptoms of it, symptoms of something that is systemic. But this tends to be where the media focus is, and where the media focus doesn't tend to be is really on what women's oppression means in reality for the vast majority of women who are working class women, For example, that the jobs that are in the majority done by women are the lowest paid jobs in society. Or, for example, the completely unaffordable cost of childcare. But because women's oppression affects women across social classes, it can appear to not be the product of a class divided society, but of something kind of outside of it. Now, what Engels's book that I referred to, The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, did was it traced the way that women's oppression arose precisely as a result of the emergence of a class divided society based upon private property. So women's oppression predated capitalism, but it becomes harnessed and integral to it. Now, Engels really at the sort of quite early on in his life studied the emergence of industrial capitalism. If we think about the factories that people used to work in, particularly, he was thinking about the cotton factories in the Northwest up in Manchester. And what he studied when he was writing about that was the way in which industrial capitalism was so exploitative and so aggressive that it threatened to annihilate any new generations of workers, because there was no one there to bring up the kids because conditions were so awful. And obviously this was a kind of unsustainable situation for capitalism. So one solution to this was to reinforce ideas about the family, wherein women would play the major role in what's called social reproduction, or producing the next generation of workers. And all sorts of attributes then get kind of attached onto women to sort of justify that women are much, more naturally kind of caring and sweet, and all those sorts of things, and are more kind of domestic, and the private sphere is their sphere. Now, of course, that role was subject to and conditioned by the needs of capitalism. And it affected not just working class women, although of course it was affecting them, but it affected the way that all women were perceived and treated throughout society. So what we've got here is women's oppression rooted in class society and affecting all women, but also dividing women on the very basis of those class divisions inside society. So the question for us then is, how do we fight it? And I think the thing is, as oppression does affect all women, it can give rise to the idea that all women therefore automatically share the same interests. And from there, one could conclude that some women can represent the interests of other women, that a minority of women can represent the interests of the vast majority. Now, I think this is a big mistake. And it was a debate that really emerged very sharply in a movement that both Rachel and I have written about in the suffragette movement. And I want to say a few words about that. One thing is that when I talk about the suffragette movement here and the leadership of it, I'm mostly referring to an organization called the Women's Social and Political Union. And what I don't want to say is not that the leadership of that organization didn't care about poor women. In fact, the plight of poor women was their motivation for getting involved and for demanding women's political rights very often. Many of them have been poor law guardians, for example. They knew about the terrible conditions that women experienced in the factories. The problem was that they believed they could represent those women if a movement was created that was not divided by class or by politics. But in practice, what that meant was the dominant class's politics predominated and was seen as just natural, as the status quo. So just with kind of women inserted in it. So the empire would still exist, but it would be better if women could be involved in running it, and that would be fairer. While the prospect of radical social change was excluded as something that was divisive. And the result, of course, was when the First World War broke out, that those dominant politics became very, very apparent, that the leadership of the Women's Social and Political Union, as an example, backed the British state, backed the maintenance of the British Empire, even to the extent that they subordinated the women's cause to it. And in fact, told women that their place was in those horrible factories, producing munitions in unsafe conditions for unequal pay. For me, what's important about Sylvia Pankhurst is the subject of Rachel's new book is her effort to create a suffragette movement that represented the vast majority of women who were working class women. And her understanding that the success of working class women's emancipation was linked to, and therefore ought to cooperate with, a mass movement that had exploded in that period against poverty and against exploitation. And what I'm referring to there is the strike wave that was sweeping Britain in that period, known now as the Great Unrest, which of course involved large numbers of men as well. And this brings us back to the way that women's oppression is based in class society. Because throughout history, what we see is that every fundamental challenge to the class structures has raised the question of women's position and the prospect of women living differently. And that's the point, I think. It seems so deceptively simple, but for liberation to be realized, we need real material revolutionary change to be won. And this is what Karl Marx, who I started with, meant when he wrote that now very famous line, philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. And what he was saying was that plenty of philosophers believe that they would change in the world by just reinterpreting it. But liberation can't be won by just thinking oppression away. It can be won by overthrowing its causes, and that is class-divided society. And that, I think, is what Friedrich Engels meant too, that the realization of individual liberation is something that we can achieve through collective action. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. That was fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to call on Rachel now. So Rachel, you just need to unmute yourself, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I unmute myself with some reluctance, not because I'm not very pleased to join you here today, because I could really very happily sit and listen to Kate, as I'm sure all the rest of us could for some time. I'm just picking up that thread, realization of individual liberation through collective living action. And that indeed, I think, really is a very pithy summary of what Sylvia Pankhurst was always striving for, not always achieving, perhaps achieved less than not, but was striving for, and equally Eleanor Marx. But thank you for this, and it's great to be talking and to be having a dialogue with Kate, and who I think has ably demonstrated in her introduction what I firmly believe about her, which is that she's the carrier of the torch. You are that next generation, Kate. And I think both in terms of scholarship of the people that we're talking about, but also action and engagement. It's a really, really important point. And it's one that I don't want to embarrass Kate, but it's one that I actually very rarely get to make in this context these days. I did a little bit in the past when I was engaged in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, in ACT UP, in the HIV and AIDS struggle. There were times when there were of being involved with people who were both the if you like our Marx's and Engels, the sort of theoretical and philosophical and scholarly practitioners, but also activists. And Kate is one of those. The following, just picking up on that, and the points that you've made and set up, that we know that history shows over and over again that women of, the female proletariat, if you want to put it that way, are the ones pushing for universal suffrage and who intensify class struggles. And I think I want to start with that point because it stands alongside. I mean, it's Rosa Luxemburg's point, and it's and part of her life struggle, and it's no accident that as an internationalist, and if you want, as a sort of European, that she was someone that both that Sylvia Pankhurst looked to and was inspired by. And I think that's quite important to put it in the context of internationalism, and that the one of the things that we then set up in tension and discussion in relation to what Kate was just saying about what happens where you have that idea of representative women's liberation or feminism, not always the same thing, but often coalescing. The idea that there is therefore a representation of all classes and that you can speak on behalf of. I'm going to do something a little bit wicked, but I was clearing out the other day and I happened to find this. If I put it there, can you see it? It's a postcard with a banner of a group of as far as group of women, and it's an equal pay strike at Tricot Folbeth, Brentford in 1976, produced for the 50th TUC Women's Conference. And there's this fantastic banner, which I think is really helpful, and it says, "We only want women's rights." And I was picking it up in a bad mood about class divisions within feminism. And I thought, yeah, that's a bloody problem, isn't it? And I sometimes see the only. And then sometimes we also see what that tension is between balancing the demand, the problems within coming out of or through a patriarchal system from which we all come from, with maintaining always that broader understanding of what class means. As a detour, it's not a detour, we were going to talk about Eleanor Marx and Sylvia Pankhurst. They're very, they're sort of useful parables, aren't they? Because there you have Marx and Pankhurst, and those are the patriarchal fathers' names. And they are daughters, in both cases, of their fathers, both of whom already obviously are established. Richard Pankhurst, perhaps lesser known to some than to Karl Marx, certainly, but he was a socialist. He failed successively as a radical socialist candidate trying to stand for parliament. He was far too radical and revolutionary. He wanted the abolition of the monarchy and many other things that would stuck in the craws of even some of his the context of the time. But also, and I think crucially for me, and Kate brings this forth in her work as well, it's something we discuss constantly, is that he was an abolitionist and he's an anti-racist, and she emerged from, yes, a middle class Manchester family who didn't necessarily have economic stability but had cultural capital and rolled along in that way that a middle class upbringing will do. But it is, first of all, significant that Sylvia Pankhurst and Eleanor Marx, we remember, they have those individuated names because they have they do have a birth advantage, and the birth advantage is in, their dads, basically, and to some extent, certainly in Sylvia's case, her mother. So that question about, for me, that what's interesting about them is that I don't see them as great heroes or heroines having overcome disadvantage and lack of it. Quite the opposite. I see them as people who overcame things that gave them privilege and advantages, and or used it in the best way that they could, and understood that the struggles that they had were shared across the board with many others. And in that case, I think that what we can see is that with both Eleanor Marx, in this case, the most specific example would be how she later in life, when she's working in the East End, identifies anti-Semitism within the trade union movement of the late 19th century, learns Yiddish and begins to stand up on behalf of, sees a race division. She identifies a race division that she's not seen before within the British Labour movement, and she begins, and she uses her position and platform literally to make sure that Jewish unions who've been trying to get themselves on Congress ballots are put forward and are able to be able to put forward their motions. In the case of Sylvia Pankhurst, I think the background in anti-colonialism, her father and her mother, which is a strange thing to think that Emmeline Pankhurst, that xenophobic, racist, bellicose supporter of imperialist wars, was in fact at one time so so convinced an opponent of what have become known as the Boer Wars, or what otherwise known as the South African Wars, depending where you grow up in history, that she left the Liberal Party in fury over it. And when all of the Pankhurst kids were either beaten up or had things thrown at them at school, was like, well, absolutely right. This was what, this is correct to oppose this war. And I do think in this context, it's like, Kate's spoken very well about the importance of that strike period and women's involvement in it. I think in terms of British history and the context that we're in now, bringing it through contemporaneously, actually in terms of all the aspects, whether it's Black Lives Matter, anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism and racism, that it is no accident that the significance of the resistance to those South African wars and what they really represented in terms of an opposition, a support. It was the first support for an anti-imperialist struggle in Britain. And it's always struck me how interesting, how present that is in a socialist or a left history, but it seems to constantly just be sort of, I don't know, it gets lost under this sort of flag of Cecil Rhodes or something. But anyway, so I think with Sylvia and Pankhurst, if we come to her, as I've said, that legacy, that inheritance of the abolitionist movement and an international way of thinking, in her case, that comes more from America, whereas in Eleanor Marx's case, it comes more from the European socialism and thinking of particularly Western Europe. But what we can see about this is, and it becomes, if you like, it's a parable. So not only do we know, and I don't need to rehearse that for any of this sort of discussion and audience, but the rift, that rupture within the Pankhurst family, clearly over the First World War, but even before that, as Kate alluded to, into the split comes between the sisters and the mother, and splits between mothers and sisters are, metaphoric and real in terms of how we engage with this. This is why they are so interesting, is over two things. It's over the undemocratic running of the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union, a union that starts out run democratically, and the rift comes between sisters and mother when it is clear that it is going to just become authoritarian. And then of course there is the split after the war. But for Sylvia Pankhurst, the teenage suffragette is just the beginning. And for me, what I'm really interested in, and that we move through and see, and as Kate says, how do these histories speak to the present? How do they remind us of, explain to us of what we know about the fact that that revolutions that have women particularly prominent or involved in them, and I'm only going to choose a handful of obvious examples, and you will know others, but whether it's the Paris Commune, whether it's the Bolsheviks and the Russian Revolution, whether it's South Africa moved at a very particular point to a more radical position in actually resisting apartheid. Whether, again, we're talking about, I mentioned ACT UP in the 80s in New York, and what's happening now, remembering what happened with the reorganization of direct action on the ground, women's involvement within what happened in a very, very diverse group who made interventions then. And of course, one could use the examples of India, but time and time again, we see that the revolutions that women were involved in were particularly successful in certain ways. No, we can rehearse their failures forever. The other thing we come across is they're always referred to as being the particularly most bloody ones. That the idea that there's this kind of the most bloody or the most extreme. So there's this kind of link with a sort of fundamental unease about what happens when you have women doing that. But Sylvia goes from suffragette to post-war communist to active anti-racist and anti-imperialist. And I think that what we can see that's interesting about her is her struggle to go to draw towards my conclusion towards my remarks when Kate landed on saying quite correctly that what we're struggling here is the problem of the question of representation. And with women and a women's liberation movement, and here we have our I'm afraid in this picture, mostly white women, not all, but mostly white women, we only want women's rights. But the question of representation, when class and race are somehow seen as secondary to this notion that women who appear to be in that sense of Engels, a reproductive class, the reproduction of the means of production, because women reproduce, because they're subject to patriarchy, because they have children, because of marriage, because of domesticity, housework, because of unequal pay, and so on. This idea that there are these links that somehow transcend class and racial difference has, and Sylvia fundamentally understood this, has been, you know, at the heart of it. But her struggle in her lifetime, right up to the end, between representation, the leaving of the Labour Party, the arguments with Lenin, indeed then the later rejoining of the Labour Party, but the fact that she ends really where we are now. She ends at the most hardest thing to become is a hero in another country, not a hero in your own country, but a hero in another country. And she ends up, because she has worked for the last 30 years of her life, not as the daughter of somebody, a man whose family name people knew, but as the supporter of a nationalist, yes, a nationalist struggle, but the most crucial anti-racist and anti-imperial struggle and fight against fascism, which was Ethiopia. And I think that brings her direct link to where we find ourselves now, and in terms of what Kate was saying about with that wonderful quote about who are the new generation and what will the new generation do with it. And on that note, I'm going to finish my remarks.
Thank you very much, Rachel. That was another brilliant speech.